All right, well, good morning. My name is Matt Kuhlman, and I'm the Mosaic pastor, so typically I'm just up the stairs there, but I'm excited to be with you guys today. It looks like some of you got the memo that it is finally flannel weather. Well done. We have finally got to fall. I love this time of year. This weekend we bought our first gallon of cider. We're fully accepting. Like, this is happening. It is football season. It's fall. We are loving it. But it reminds me of times in the fall when I'd go to my grandma's house and she would, have you ever been to your grandma's house and you walk in and you know she's making that special thing that you love? Right, for me, it was scotcheroos. Anyone? Scotcheroos? Anyone's mouth just start watering? You're like, how dare you, right? I loved my grandma's scotcheroos, and it is one of those recipes that for our family, after she passed, was passed down to my mom, and the grandkids now are making this. And I know when we make it in our house now, if we set it out on the counter and we don't keep track of our middle child, she will have devoured the top section of chocolate all on her own, right? And but there's recipes that we pass down from generation to generation. And there's even some fun stories of maybe it's grandmas or moms who, when they're asked for this special recipe that their family wants to share as well, she says, "Over my dead body," right? I am the only one who can make this. And I've seen some pictures of gravestones that literally have that famous recipe on it. Like, she literally held it over her dead body, like it actually works, right? She put it on the gravestone. And it's so interesting, some of these recipes. But you see that grandma's chocolate chip recipe, you value that as a family. I was at an auction a few years ago. I thoroughly enjoy going to farm auctions and finding treasures in my eyes and junk in my wife's eyes. But I love just exploring farm auctions and finding what's out there. And there was a farm auction that I was at on this wagon. There was this really old, worn box. It was a wood box. And you could tell it had been well used. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And I opened it up, and inside was a bunch of recipes. And it had a bunch of writing in all the recipes. And I looked at it for a bit, and I'm like, there's just no value in that, right, anymore. With Pinterest, you can find any recipe, and you don't need to put it in a little box anymore. So I didn't think anything of it. I put it back down. I was looking through other things. And then about a quarter of the way through the auction, this box comes up for auction. And I would have put a value of $7 on it, maybe, right? And the auction starts, and all of a sudden, the bidding just shoots off here. And the bidding lands and ends being sold for around $800. Okay, I said $800 for this little box. Am I the only one who thought that's crazy? Yeah, man, I shouldn't be bidding against you guys on auctions. But $800 for this box is that is nuts. And I turn around and I realize there was family who was bidding against each other for this box, for grandma's recipe box. And you're like, y'all could maybe use some counseling and figure out some of this outside of an auction setting. But what is so interesting, and I think the value they put on this is because it wasn't just recipes, right? You can find recipes on Pinterest and just any site online, right? You can find these types of recipes. But what was special about these recipes is that on each one, it had handwritten instructions or advice from grandma, right? It had 50 years advice on how to not burn the cookies, right? How to mix the right amount of flour so the cakes are fluffy, right? And the temperature to set things at so the brownies would be nice and gooey a little bit on the inside, but not burnt on the outside. And it had all of this advice and instruction. And what we find is that you only get that kind of advice and instruction from years and years of work and trial and error and figuring out how to do it well. And the family found value in that. Right? They found value because it was grandma's words, who could no longer tell them those things. So they wanted this instruction box. They wanted these recipes that had grandma's advice on it, because that's priceless at the end of the day, right? For this summer, we've been in a series on David, and we find him now at a point where he is sharing some last words, some last advice, some last knowledge that he has. And I want to remind us, over the course of the summer, we started at the beginning of the summer with David as just a young shepherd boy, where he was anointed king to be someday. And that someday didn't happen for a while, right? He ran from Saul for quite a few years. He killed Goliath. The story of David and Goliath is in there. We talked about that. We saw how David then becomes king and reigns really well over the nation. And he has a lot of good battles, and he gains territory, and he seems to be doing a pretty good job as king. And over the last month, we've read different stories about the turmoil that starts to happen in David's life. That he may be a pretty good king, but his role as dad, his role as leader in his household was not very good. We read and we listened to the story of David and Bathsheba, a story about his kids and the turmoil that happened between his family and relationships that happened in there that really shouldn't have. We saw David not respond to some of those situations in the right way, and other siblings killing others in that instance, right? We've really walked through this whole story of David and have gotten a big snapshot of David's life. And now we find him at the end of his life. He's tired, and he realizes that it is the end, and he would need to pass on this throne to somebody. And David is left with a few words. And he calls on his son Solomon. And I want to pull up a genealogy map here a minute for you guys to understand this a bit better. Can you pull up that family map? Maybe, maybe not. Okay, I'll explain it. So the family map, I see a light change. Perfect. Okay, so you see Jesse on the top. You may have seen this before. I've pulled this up a few times. Jesse's on the top. He is the father of David. So he was in the very beginning of our story of David when he brings out all of his sons to show, right? David is the one with the crown. And then underneath David is all of his wives. You're like, wow, he has got a lot of wives and a lot of concubines. You may remember from the story of Maacah's kids, Absalom and Tamar, and how Amnon, the stepbrother, like the relationship there was very unholy and very impure. But then if you look at the other side, you've got Bathsheba, who was married to Uriah until David took her, right? And Bathsheba had a few sons. One of them is Solomon. Okay, so David calls Bathsheba's son in, Solomon, into really the final moments of his life, and he has some words for him there. And that's where we're going to jump into our story of David's final instructions to his son Solomon. 1 Kings 2, starting in verse 1. When the time drew near for David to die, he gave a charge to Solomon, his son. I'm going to go the way of all the earth, he said, so be strong and act like a man. I want to quick pause here a minute because this saying, act like a man, could be read in a few different ways. For me, I had dropped off my daughter this week for her first day of school ever. And as dad, I dropped her off and I acted like a man, right? I showed no emotion. I was a good man. And then dropped her off and then got into the car. I'm like, I did a really good job. I held myself together. I called my wife to explain how it went, and I just started weeping. I was like, oh my word, she doesn't need us anymore, right? But I showed all of this emotion, and our culture would say that is not acting like a man. Right? To act like a man is to be emotionless and to not cry and to not express oneself in that way. But this isn't what David is saying in this story here. The word that David uses in that ancient language is called andrizo. And andrizo actually more so means this act of a courageous or virtuous manner. So what David is saying to Solomon is saying, act in a virtuous way. Act in a way where you have courage. He's saying act like a man, but what he's saying behind the scene is be a good man, right? Act with this courageous nature. We also see this word used in the New Testament when Paul is speaking to the church. He uses this andrizo language where it says, be watchful, stand firm in the faith, act like men, be strong. So it's not don't be emotionless like this culture would like to often describe it. It's this idea of virtuous and courageous manner that we find here. So let's continue. So be strong, act like a man. Verse 3, and observe what the Lord your God requires. Walk in obedience to him and keep his decrees and commands, his laws and his regulations. as written in the law of Moses. Do this so you may prosper in all that you do and wherever you go, and that the Lord may keep his promise to me. If your descendants watch how they live, and if they walk faithfully before me with all their heart and soul, you will never fail to have a successor on the throne to Israel. So what we find here is David's giving this instruction to him, saying if you follow these things, you will prosper, right? Someone will always be on your throne. Verse 5, now, and he gives more instructions here. Now you yourself know what Joab, son of Zeruiah, did to me, what he did to the two commanders of Israel's armies, Abner, son of Ner, and Amasa, son of Jether. He killed them, shedding their blood in peacetime as if in battle. And with the blood he stained the belt around his waist and the sandals on his feet. Deal with him according to your wisdom, but do not let his gray head go down to the grave in peace. Verse 7, but show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. They stood by me when I fled from your brother Absalom. And remember, you have with you Shimei, son of Jerah, the Benjamite from Bahurim, who called down bitter curses on me the day I went to Mahanaim. When he came down to meet me at the Jordan, I swore to him by the Lord, I will not put you to death by the sword. But now, do not consider him innocent. You are a man of wisdom. You will know what to do with him. Bring his gray head down to the grave in blood. Then David rested with his ancestors and was buried in the city of David. So pretty interesting advice here, right? Last words of David are in these 10 verses here. But what I want to first name is like this, what we don't read, right? David is giving final instructions, but what we don't read is he's not giving advice to Solomon like, hey, you know that chariot you've been having your eye on? Go buy it, right? Life is short. YOLO, you only live once. You should go buy that chariot. Right? He doesn't say those things. He doesn't say, go find the finest fruits in the world and partake in eating really well. No, David doesn't have that kind of language. What does David give as advice in his final moments of life? We find 5 different kind of statements or ways to live that David is saying, and I want to go over those things a minute here. What we find is number 1, be strong, act like a man, courageous in a virtuous manner. He's saying, be strong, right? We kind of covered this in this idea of what it means to be a man. Right? Second thing, observe what God requires. And David explains that this looks to be like following the law of Moses and obeying the 10 commandments and knowing what those things are and abiding by those things. Third thing is, do not let Joab's gray head go down to the grave in peace. This is an interesting turn, right? This is kind of weird advice, like on your deathbed to be saying, hey, there's this one person I don't like anymore. I'm going to need you to kill him for me. Oh, that's a weird turn from the advice we had originally. So what do we do with that? I want to give you a little bit more context around the relationships that David has, especially with the ones he's saying, don't let their gray head go down in peace. Right? This first character, Joab, he would have been very close to David. He was one of the commanders, and David would often tell him things to do, and he would go do it. He would have been probably very trusted by David, but he would often dance around what David actually wanted him to do, and sometimes deliberately disobey him. Joab was the character who killed Abner and Amasa, who were some of David's other commanders because he had a beef with them. He had an issue with what they were doing. But David did not. He says in these verses here that he killed him like it was wartime, even though it was a time of peace, right? It was innocent blood that should not have been taken. We know from an earlier story that Joab also killed Absalom, who David was running from Absalom, his son, because Absalom was pursuing him. But David never wanted to kill his son. David understood the relationship there, but he didn't want his son to die, and yet Joab goes out and kills Absalom. So there's a relationship issue between David and Joab, and we see that Joab isn't listening to David, and David is kind of making a stand here. He wants justice for the things that Joab has done wrong. We also find number 4, the fourth advice, the fourth instruction that David gives: show kindness to the sons of Barzillai. And what's interesting about this is that these people of Barzillai, when David was on the run, when he was fleeing from the throne, we read that a few weeks ago. When he was fleeing, these people housed him and they fed him. And David is saying, make sure you show kindness to them. Make sure you let them know how much we appreciate what they've done. And then number 5, keep an eye on Shimei, son of Gera. Don't let him go unpunished. Now, if you were with us last week, that was the story where as David is fleeing, there's this guy who's walking alongside him as they're hiking and throwing rocks at him, cursing at him, and belittling him. And David is saying, I promised him that I would not kill him, but justice has to be served. So go take care of him. So we've got all of these pieces of advice, these instructions, these last 5 things that David gives. And then he lands with a promise, right? If you obey the Lord's commands, you will prosper in all that you do. And when we look at the totality of all of these pieces of advice, there's a different passage in Scripture that I think really encompasses it really well. From later in the Old Testament, there is a prophet by the name of Micah who is speaking to a group of people, and I think there's 2 verses in there one verse in there that I think really completes this well. So I want to read that from Micah 6, verse 8. It says this: He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. So we see in there Micah giving 3 things. And I think when we look at David's pieces, all of those 5 pieces fit into what Micah is trying to get across here as well. And I want to look at how those connect well today. So this first one is act justly. And when we look at David's advice, we see 2 of these fit into it when we understand some of the context and some of the story. It initially looks like David is just out for blood as he's on his deathbed. But what David is actually looking for is justice. So that do not let Joab's gray head go to the ground unpunished, right? And then the second, keep an eye on Shimei. Do not let him have peace either. So he's saying, be diligent, watch out for these things. And these 2 pieces of advice tell us that David actually values justice. And I want to use that word lightly or with caution because that word has sometimes gained attention from the culture in different ways of people wanting justice in ways that are not biblical. But what David wants here is justice in a different sense. And I want us to understand justice is a good thing. In certain areas. I've almost got a 4-year-old, McKenna. I was talking about her earlier. If I didn't discipline her, right? If I didn't bring justice into her life in ways that she needed it, I would be a bad dad, right? And I'd be raising a potential delinquent of society, right? Like, discipline does matter. You all know kids who have not been disciplined when you're walking around Meyer. You're like, that kid needs to be disciplined, right? The justice matters in our society. We want justice to happen. And I would argue that when David looks at his life, he doesn't see enough justice. He doesn't see himself doing justice in the right ways. He may have been a good king. He may have been a good military leader. But as of late, we don't see him being a very good dad or a very good leader over the people he has an immediate relationship with. When Amnon slept with his half-sister Tamar, David did nothing about it. He got mad, right? He was angry about it, but he didn't do anything. He didn't discipline Amnon in the way he should have been. And so Absalom, his other son, went out and felt like he had to go kill Amnon. So this created even more family turmoil because David isn't stepping in and bringing justice to a place that was very unjust. Okay? So David is looking at his life thinking, okay, is he thinking, I didn't bring about justice in the way I should have. Even in his relationships with like Joab and maybe his military leaders, did he let his friends and coworkers, the military people he was working with, go run around rampant without any discipline, without any correction in their life that they needed? I would argue that David, now on his deathbed, is saying to his son Solomon, live differently. right? Live in a way that is just. Do not let the things go around you unchecked. Make sure the things are going well. David is saying, act justly. And the second thing in the prophets, so act justly. Second thing we read in Micah is to love mercy. And I think this is, we also see one piece of David's advice fit into this, where we see him say, but show kindness to the sons of Barzillai of Gilead, and let them be among those who eat at your table. And I think this is beautiful because I don't think there's any better way to show kindness than to invite somebody to your table, right? To share a meal with someone, to invite them into your home and open up the kitchen table, right? And we see more so that Micah is saying not only just to be merciful, but the language he uses is to love mercy, which is very different than being merciful. Right? We can be merciful by opening a door at the grocery store or at a store as somebody else is walking in, smiling at them, showing kindness in those ways. But I think loving mercy is a very different thing, right? Where if you're loving something, you're choosing actively to do it. Right? You're seeking those things out. So when Micah in this verse says, love mercy, it's, okay, how do I actually find it in ways that I can do those things actively in my life? It's looking for all the situations that you don't need to just sit back on, that you can actively seek these things or actively seek these things out. And the last thing from Micah is to walk humbly with your God. And we find that David says this quite a bit with the be strong, obey the Lord's commands, act like a man, right? Act in virtuous nature of what the Bible describes. And in this, I want to name that in our story of David and his advice that he gives, he names follow the laws of Moses, right? For the Old Testament people, that was the law. The law of Moses was the law that they abound by the 10 Commandments and the laws that are in Leviticus and some of those things. But for us today, it's a little bit different. Okay, when Jesus came in the New Testament, Jesus was actually asked by the religious leaders and the Pharisees, okay, we've got all of these laws, the 10 Commandments, all these laws in Leviticus and Numbers. What is the best law? Like, how do we actually abide by all of these different things? And Jesus responds with, love God and love your neighbor. And so what I want us to think about today, when we hear this obey God or obey the law, that is what we're as Christians listening into, the love God and love your neighbor. But the question is, how do we walk humbly with our God? Right? How do we actually walk humbly with our God? Because I truly believe when we take a step back and humble ourselves in a relationship with God, where we're not focused so much on the outside world, where we're even potentially alone and allowing silence to be around us, walking humbly with our God. When we do this, the other things actually happen way better. Because when we have a direct relationship with God, when we're actively pursuing Him, seeking justice happens because we know the sight of God a bit better. We understand what God would want out of a situation. We would love mercy more because we know God is merciful. So when you understand His character, some of those other pieces naturally fall into place here. But what's so fascinating is I'd argue it's hard to do in our culture, especially this fall, right? We're having kids go back off to school. Fall ramps up. There seems to be a lot of busyness and chaos in the world. We're getting into some crazy times politically even, right? There's a lot going on. There's busyness and there's lots of relationships that we may have the opportunity to bounce off of, coworkers, family, friends. All of these things take our time and we are getting pulled further and further away from walking humbly with God and walking alone with God in some natures. And there's a verse, or not a verse, but a passage that Dietrich Bonhoeffer writes in Life Together, in a book called Life Together. And it says this: whoever cannot be alone should be aware of community. Such people will only do harm to themselves and to the community. Alone you stood before God when God called you. Alone you had to obey God's voice. Alone you had to take up your cross, struggle, and pray. And alone you will die and give an account to God. You cannot avoid yourself, for it is precisely God who has called you out. If you do not want to be alone, you are rejecting God's call to you, and you have no part in the community of those who are called. Those are pretty devastating words, right? Like, being alone is highly important, and it speaks to me because I love being with people. I love gathering around community and doing things with people, to the extent that when me and my wife went on our first big vacation together after being married, we went on a cruise, and we're sitting there on the sun beach on the top, sitting out reclining, and we were talking about how nice it was, right? We're newly married, things are great, and I'm like, you know what would make this better? More people. That's not a thing you say as you're enjoying a romantic time together. I figured out. I've gotten better over the course of the years. But that's how, I don't want to be alone. I want to be gathered around people. So in these words, those are hard words to hear. There's some conviction in my life, and maybe in yours too, where we surround ourselves with people and we surround ourselves with a relationship. And there's a place for that. Don't get me wrong. But if we're not first spending time alone with God, none of that matters. Right? If we're not actively seeking who God is, if we're not in the Word with Him, if we don't have a prayer life, we shouldn't be trying to gain community around us to point them to Him. Right? Because if we're not doing that with God ourselves, who are we actually pointing them to? Right? I think for us, we need to think about this. When we think about this idea of being with God and walking humbly with God, it starts by maybe just some silence and stepping back from the chaos of this world and saying, God, where are you in this? And allowing God to speak in the silence. Isaiah 55 says this, my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts your thoughts. I think for us, when we pursue relationship with God, it needs to happen because our thoughts are not naturally God's thoughts. And the only way we can understand who God is and the perspective that He has is by getting into the Word of God and by prayer and by worship and by being intentional about being humble with Him. And I'd argue that if we miss that step of the advice that David gives about obeying God's command, walking humbly with Him, we're missing everything else. Nothing else is important if we don't get this step correctly. So when we look at the last words of people in general, there's often a clarity that comes from it. Right? When people are on their final moments or know the end is near, you get a different sense about them, right? As a pastor, I've gotten to sit with people who are closer to the end, right? And I've gotten the chance to be with family who have recently lost a loved one. And you instantly understand that there's a different value for those people, right? The final words matter. And what I notice, first of all, is that their walk with God matters way more at the end. And the family wants to know about their walk with God, right? Their relationships matter. Their family matters. People matter. They want those people gathered around them. And how they treated people matter, right? Sometimes as they have their final words, they've got regret in life because of how they treated people, right? The way they treat people matter. And I want to be honest with you right now. We have a blessing in the midst of those things. As people who are all sitting here, I've checked. Most of you are still breathing, right? No one has dozed off. I can't, unless I can see in the light. No, right? You're all actively living and breathing yet, right? So let's take a look at David's story. Let's take a look at the final advice that he gives, even the final advice of other people that have gone on before us, and say, what do they wish their life looked like differently? Right? Because for us right now, we still have the opportunity to do something about that. Right? We get to continue living. So if we picture ourselves years down the road as we're saying our final last words, what things would we wish we would have done differently? And maybe start doing those things now. right? We have an opportunity to live differently now. Let's not wait until we're on our deathbeds for that. See, I don't think there is anyone better to model from than David in the Old Testament. I think he's got a wonderful story that is filled with loving God and, yes, surrounded by failures, but he will continue to look to God through all of those things and continues to turn back to God even though he sins and even though he fails. See, as we wrap up today, I want you to put yourself in the seat of Solomon. These final words of David in 1 Kings here that ends in verse 10, that next verse tells us that David dies. He moves on. So this moment between man and son, king and future king, David and Solomon, David may have this may have been his very last breaths. And Solomon may have been kneeling down by his bed, holding his dad's hand, hearing this final advice. And I want you to hear the echo of the words from Micah in this. Picture yourself in this moment. What does the Lord require of you? To act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with your God. The homework I'm going to give you this week, it feels fitting since we're back into school, right? But the homework or the challenge that I'm living into too this week is naming one of those things that you want to do differently. Act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. Think about what one of those things in your life do you need to start doing a little bit better. Maybe as this teaching was happening, you got a spark of some idea or something that you want to do. Maybe that's the Holy Spirit convicting you saying, this is what's missing right now for us. And it's time we make that change. Choose one of these concepts from Micah and be intentional and deliberate about how you view this way, view these ideas, these final instructions, these last words, and let's start living in that way now. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father, we thank you for your word, and we thank you for these final words of David, this advice, this instruction, that even though he's giving it to the next king, God, I think we can really relate to these things. And we have an opportunity right now full of breath in our lungs, an opportunity around us in relationship and the way we live to do something for you. And God, I ask that we don't put that off anymore, that we feel the conviction that might be in our lives from the Holy Spirit and we do something about it. God, give us the courage to stand up when it's hard and to say no when there's opportunity, even if we need to be alone with you. God, we know you're there and we know you're with us. God, help us feel your presence. In your name we pray. Amen.